Welcome everybody to the COVID-19 webinar series on policymaking in the throes of a global crisis. My name is Scott Barrett. I'm a professor in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is a university professor at Columbia, a member also of the SIPA faculty and the Faculty of Economics and the Mailman School of Public Health. And Jeff is also director of the Center for Sustainable Development. We're joined by Yanis Ben Amor, who is executive director of the Center for Sustainable Development and an adjunct professor in SIPA. And our guest today is Robert Shapiro, who is a professor, the Wallace S. Sayre Professor of Government in the Department of Political Science at Columbia, and a professor of International and Public Affairs at SIPA, so a colleague of ours. And he specializes in American politics, public opinion, policymaking, political leadership, and the mass media, topics that I'm sure no one is interested in, but no, I'm just kidding. It's actually, the timing of this is perfect. Just before coming on the air, as it were, we were talking about the debate. I'm sure a number of people watching right now also watched the debate last night. And I think the debate kind of set up Professor Shapiro for his talk today, because what we saw were two totally different, not only personalities, but two totally different beliefs about the threat that the United States and the world faces right now and what to do about it. So what we're going to do is ask Professor Shapiro to speak for around 20 minutes or so, and then Jeff and Yanis and I will ask some questions, and then we're going to be looking for questions coming in from the audience as well. So Bob, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me, and especially inviting me after this auspicious occasion of last night's debate. All right, I'm going to talk for 20 minutes. Scott, if you or someone, if you can just give me a 1-minute warning if I run over. I can talk for, well, hours is an exaggeration, but I could talk for a long time. And if I had slides that I have on this, I could talk for longer. I want to combine a political statement with a political science process. The political statement I want to comment on, and this was one from Donald Trump last night, which I thought it was his best moment in the debate in terms of saying something that made sense and that was important. And in responding to what he and his and the Republicans were doing on the Supreme Court justice nomination, Trump justified it by starting out by saying, and I think correctly, elections have consequences. And they have consequences with regard to policy making in a very significant way, especially when you have, well, one party in dominant control of government. Okay, now the process, which was more of an academic one, that I want to compare this to, was in 1950, the American Political Science Association put together a commission to do a report entitled "Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System." And the idea there was that the American political system was kind of sluggish to deal with policy and political problems, in contrast to a parliamentary system where you could have turnovers in government, which could lead to significant changes in the direction of policy. In the United States, you couldn't get that because the parties really weren't that different from each other. And also there was the possibility of divided government that could occur, that could slow things down. And so their recommendations were that we should have parties that offered voters more choices in elections, and that could lead to changes in policies. And I won't go into any more details of the report. Well, fast forward to the present, and you ask for it, you've got it, and you've now got parties that really are distinctive. Well, you can either call it ideologically or just distinctive on all manner of public policy issues. Now, the comparison here is today with what things were like back in the 1950s, where you had more heterogeneous parties. The Democratic Party was an uneasy coalition of Northern liberals and Southerners who were conservative on certain kinds of things, most noteworthy, civil rights and race. And Northern liberals who were liberal, and basically in a fashion that we think of. although more liberal today on social issues and civil rights kinds of issues. And the Republican Party was a more heterogeneous party. It was a conservative party on economic, big government, welfare, regulation, anti-labor kinds of issues. But it was also a more liberal or moderate party when it came to issues of rights and liberties. They were still, in effect, the party of Abraham Lincoln. They were also the party of the Equal Rights Amendment, for women. That changed over time. We can say whether it was abrupt or not, but by the 1960s, as there was a transformation on the issue of race with the rise of the civil rights movement, the experience of World War II maybe having some significant effect on this, and also with the northern wing of the Democratic Party ascending within the party, the whole civil rights struggle, and most importantly, the election of Lyndon Johnson. Well, Lyndon Johnson becoming president and then being reelected as president led to the transformation of the Democratic Party. So it became the liberal party, pro-civil rights party. And what happened as a result of that, through the internal intra-party struggle and strategic moves made by Republicans, that is Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, where the Southerners became very uncomfortable within the Democratic Party and basically got purged or replaced within the Democratic Party. And the Republicans, in a concerted effort by emphasizing law and order issues, which are very important today, that have racial connotations to them, as we know, became the more anti-civil rights kind of party. So the parties that had been different from each other on economic welfare and regulatory kinds of issues now became different from each other also on these kinds of social and civil rights kinds of issues. And with the repurging of the Southern Democrats, the Democratic Party really became very strongly the more pro-labor rather than anti-labor kind of issues. And to make a long story just very short, as new issues arose, and it wasn't obvious that this necessarily had to happen, the Democratic Party became the liberal party on issues like abortion and gay rights and so forth, and the Republicans the more conservative party. The example that I like to point out is in 1972 to 1973, there were no partisan differences at the level of political leaders nor at the level of the mass public on the abortion issue. That is, the partisans were equally pro-choice and pro-life on those kinds of things, and maybe even the Republicans a little bit more pro-choice. But anyway, the parties became distinctive on these kinds of issues, and also they became more competitive as related to these strategic choices. That is, the Republicans being able to pick up support in the South. What used to be the solid Democratic South legacy of the Civil War has now become, and if you look at the Electoral College map, you can see it, the solid South on the Republican side, all red states. And the parties become much more competitive because throughout most of the latter part of the 20th century, the Democrats basically maintained control of the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the Republicans occasionally, in the 1952, were able to control one of the houses. But beginning in 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan on his coattails, the Republicans took the Senate and became competitive for the Senate thereafter. And then in 1994, Bill Clinton's disastrous midterm congressional election, the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich as the leader and would-be president of the United States at the time. Thereafter, they became competitive for the House, so that thereafter it became possible for either party to have unified partisan control of the House, of Congress and the presidency, and therefore the judiciary, as we now see sort of on steroids, so to speak, much more contentious than before. In partisan terms, so that you have more heated competition where the stakes are greater because the parties are more ideologically or policy in agreement internally, which could lead to dramatic changes in policymaking if government went from unified Republican to unified Democratic. And we saw this in recent years, case in point, Obama wins landslide election, and he's able, and he had to deal with obviously an economic crisis, but he's able to push through the Affordable Care Act by virtue of the fact that he had unified government and for a brief period had a filibuster-proof Senate until he lost it when Scott Brown was elected to replace Kennedy. So you've got this heated competition, And then, so Donald Trump wins with unified Republican government. Elections have consequences. He's able to do very striking things: tax reform, deregulation, all manner of things in foreign policy and international agreements, as we've seen just by executive action, and tax reform being significant. And perhaps the most important legacy of all will be the transformation of the courts. That's already occurred and will probably occur further whether he wins the election or not. This has raised, and this is where we get to the present with the COVID-19 crisis. This has raised the stakes. It's raised, and I'll just state this in simple terms. It's increased the emotional heat of the political conflict that exists, that has all kinds of consequences for policymaking. It could lead to gridlock if in the context of divided government, which we don't have. More importantly, it's had psychological effects, and the political psychologists have had a field day with this because of processes of cognitive dissonance, motivated reasoning. You can read all about this stuff. It's affected people's perceptions of reality, what's true and what's false. That is, the statement that the parties live in different worlds. Well, based on what they say, and also what they do now. This is where the COVID-19 crisis comes in. Based on what they say, what they say may not in fact reflect their true feelings and perceptions, but they feel obliged to not acknowledge certain things in reality to kind of hold true to their worldview in terms of their policy preferences. And so there's disagreements, on perceptions of reality and facts, and people who write about this often bring up the famous Patrick Moynihan quote, that people are entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to their facts. Well, they seem to be now entitled to their facts, alternative reality, all of those kinds of things. And what's striking in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, in terms of how the emotions have affected things, once an issue becomes partisan, and where the crisis at hand involves the day-to-day life and behavior of individuals, and dealing with the crisis. And then the COVID-19 here is really extraordinary in that effect. We have, and I recommended two papers, current papers that on this issue. It's affected how people, not only what they think about the virus and what government should do about it, but it's affected their day-to-day behavior in terms of wearing masks, social distancing, and the like. Where we now, in this day and age, we can measure social distance by data from people's cell phones, and so we actually know that what anecdotally seems to be the case seems to be true based on available data. People don't wear masks, or do, depending on their partisanship, heavily influenced by political leaders in all this. That is, leadership is really important here. This particular, Scott Barrett and I were talking about this, and he sort of emphasized something I had said in one of the articles I sent, that whereas crises can be used to unify people, this one was a crisis, but it hasn't unified people. Well, it only unifies, it can only potentially unify the country, like 9/11, the terrorist attacks did for a brief moment, for a short period, if the issue is not made a partisan issue. Well, this has turned into a partisan issue, and as I was saying to Scott and others right before we went on the air here, is that Trump could have, if he were a different person, handled this differently and used this as an opportunity for presidential leadership to deal with a problem, pull the country together, enhance his popularity by virtue of doing things that could deal effectively with the health problem, and in dealing with the health problem, also dealing with the economic problem, but also engaging in further economic stimulus that could have improved things, where he would have involved adopting things that the Democrats would have supported, but it would have worked to his benefit in the current election. The economy, given all his accomplishments, the crown jewel was the economy as gauged by the stock market, but more importantly by economic growth, and even more important than that, the unemployment rate. And that's just gone down the tubes with all this. And that was the setting for the debate that occurred last night, and it's the setting for what voters will do in the current election, especially even if their votes are freely and fairly made and counted. And that's the situation that we're in right now. And I think I'm going to stop with that.
Thank you very much, Bob. You stayed well within your 20 minutes, which is pretty rare for a professor. So congratulations on that. Jeff, if you don't mind, maybe I'll start off with asking one question, then you can follow up. And Yanis, as always, you can keep us on the true path of public health. So, because politics has a way of steering us off of true paths. Yeah, I guess the biggest question in my mind about all this, so we've got this polarized, not only a political situation, but a social situation in the United States. And it's not only within the United States, but the US has its own very ripe version of this. And then we're hit by this virus, which becomes a national crisis. And as you say, it could have gone differently. If there had been a different person as president, it could have gone differently and the country could have united around it. But instead, it went off in a very different direction. And as one of the papers you distributed to us shows, this has been extremely costly to the United States. So it's one of the, it's the reason why the US performance in this crisis has been so dismal. Lack of leadership, but also a lack of a consistent view about the nature of the challenge, its importance, and what all of us need to do to address it. So it's really quite stunning. And I'm just wondering what do we do? I mean, one of the papers was suggesting that what we need to do is communicate public health in a way that will get people to, but it seems to me that's idealistic. We have people who are trying to communicate in that way, and I think they have an audience. But if my worldview doesn't admit those facts, I don't listen to them. I may mock them, but I'm not going to pay attention to them, and I'm not going to respond to their, to their recommendations. So how do you repair a country when it's hit by a crisis, instead of pulling up its socks and putting the polarization aside to deal with this common threat? Instead, it doubles down on the polarization. And we're seeing this not only with the crisis, but with the election coming up, and in terms of the conduct of the election, not the outcome, but just the conduct. So what's the recommendation? What do we actually do? What can we do to put this ship right again?
Well, in terms of dealing with things, there's the short term and the long term. That is the long-term solution to deal with polarization, and we can come back to that. And that's a tough enough question in itself. Short term, it's both potentially more difficult or conceivably easier. In terms of what the public itself is doing and what the public it needs to do, they need to come to agreement that they need to behave in a certain way. Either they need one of two ways. One is they've got to be persuaded by political leaders, and it's got to be political leaders that are in agreement on what the solution is. And that's why a partisan conflict environment is the worst case for this, because with partisan leaders in disagreement, their fellow partisans among the public and the electorate are going to take cues from the partisan leaders. And so in this case, you needed a consensus way of dealing with it. Because the public, is not all knows that it's not all knowing, and they can't figure things out. They depend on leaders, and they depend on the mass media and so forth too. But leaders are the first players in the game, so to speak. Short of that, unless there's something that happens in reality that becomes so obvious, that is, despite how Trump is dealing with the situation, if people see in their communities the situation is so dire and there's such an emergency that they really know that they have to change their behavior. That is, they can figure it out by themselves. I'll just give you a case in point. The public is capable of figuring stuff out by itself. One case in point, during the Bill Clinton impeachment, the parties were in disagreement about whether Bill Clinton should be convicted. The public sorted it out because they understood Monica Lewinsky and the scandal that happened, and they figured out that this wasn't an impeachable offense. It was bad. Clinton was, morally despicable, but this was not impeachable. So despite the partisan conflict, this was simple enough for them to figure out. So reality has to set in a way that can't be ignored, or political leaders have to be united. And in terms of what political leaders to trust. This goes back to critics of public opinion like Walter Lippmann, who argued that elites are much more important. The public is has limitations and difficulties. And of course, for Lippmann, the quintessential elites were experts. That is expert government administration and all that stuff. You rely on the experts. Well, now expertise has been politicized, even though there's a huge consensus in the public health community. There's even a consensus, and maybe Jeff can correct me if I'm wrong, even among economists and some conservative ones. Conservative economists say we've got to get the virus under control in order to get the economy back together again. And to see conservative economists say this, and some of our friends on campus is quite extraordinary. With this kind of consensus, you would think we can deal with this particular kind of crisis.
Jeff, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for great discussion and a great topic. I assume if you were to plug in the macro variables right now into a normal equation predicting a presidential outcome, in my day we knew them as the Ray-Fair equations. I don't know who does them now, but I would guess that Trump would be completely clobbered. The economy is a complete disaster, and so on. If you add in 210,000 deaths, a blubbering idiot as far as I'm concerned, that is beyond description in every way, that would just add more to this. And he's trailing. But of course, what completely perplexes me is the pretty rock solid 43% approval rating, which just doesn't budge year in, year out. And I'd love your take on that. Also, whether COVID has changed that. And just to add some footnotes, whether there is evidence that when the epidemic comes through a state or congressional district, it makes any difference at all in terms of voter support and so on. But you said that now the voters live in different worlds, and I think there is a debate of, is the difference a difference of economic structure, occupation, class, culture, or media outlet? It's obviously all of those in an overlapping way. But how do you see that issue of what is going on? Because for me, it's completely perplexing that we are anywhere close to where we are right now.
Okay, there are a lot of pieces to what you've stated. Let me start with kind of explaining the rock solid, base of support that Trump has. I think this, when I talk about this emotional level of partisan conflict that exists, some people have referred to it as that it's motivated, that they're kind of tribal social group influences at work here. Others like me look for an issue policy relevance to it. There are these tribal differences, but they're policy and issue consequences, for this kind of thing. And it's hard to disentangle the two. But in terms of why this base of support remains solid, the kinds of things that Trump proposed to do were things that base supported. Now maybe not in a rational way, thinking in terms of their own costs and benefits, but in terms of support for deregulation, tax reform, and also the Supreme Court issue is significant among people who vote on the basis of social moral values issues like abortion and gay rights and the like. And the emotional level here, I mean, the parties are at odds with each other in terms of culture and values. They're also at odds on issues, and it's come down to emotional dislike for the other for the other party and and their supporters, and there are data that get at that. People are asked to rate Republicans and Democrats in terms of a feeling thermometer going from 0 to 100, and partisans, really they dislike each other, and the base of support, acknowledges Trump's defects and faults in lying and so forth, but they can rationalize it that he delivers on policy, but also for them it's the choice, and the choice is Trump or the other party, and it comes down to the other party being either worse or less desirable enough that they're going to stick by him. In terms of reality affecting all of this, having data at the level of congressional districts would be interesting to see how that has consequences there. Clearly the predictions about Trump losing also carries over to Democrats picking up seats in the Senate and even the House as well. And right now that is just really an empirical question. But it really comes down to emotions, social groups, and the issue component. Now, I don't know if I hit on everything, but anything, let me know.
Very good. Thanks.
Yanis, do you have a question you want to ask?
I have a comment vis-a-vis your question, and then I have a quick question, which is not about public health. So, last night, Trump kept on hammering that if Biden had been president during the COVID crisis, then 2 million people would have died. I think that Biden really missed an opportunity to explain where this number 2 million comes from, that it's actually, if nothing had happened, if there were no interventions, then 2 million people would have died, which clearly would not have been the case under a Biden administration. And the best example is to show that, South Korea and the US had their first case on the same day, which was January 20th. And in South Korea, they are at less than 500 deaths, and we are now over 200,000. So I guess my question is the following, and this is me as a new American, understanding the way that politics function. So House of Representatives is voted every 2 years, President every 4, and the Senate every 6. I would argue that the House of Representatives gives you a better pulse of how the country feels at a given moment than the Senate, because there is this delay. So how is it that the Supreme Court justice that's about to be intronized for the next 40 years based on her age really does give a pulse of the nation if some of the senators that are going to vote for her are from 6 years ago and don't necessarily represent how people are feeling? So you're saying that elections have consequences. There is an election coming up in less than 40 days where you would get the new pulse of the nation. So it's basically a question of legitimacy. And then the follow-up question is, have the Democrats ever pulled that trick on the Republicans when, it was a flip side situation?
Oh, okay. Well, let's work backwards. In terms of the Democrats pulling this on Republicans, they've tried it before in a conflict with in a less conflictual partisan conflict situation. And there people cited the case of Lyndon Johnson trying to elevate Abe Fortas to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and that was being pushed pretty late. There was some scandal associated with Fortas as well, and that fell through. But that was during a period where the parties were more heterogeneous, and there would be crossover voters from the other party. The big question is, would the Democrats do the same thing in the same situation as the Republicans? And I think they probably would. I think the level of partisan conflict is such, the stakes are so great that they would do it. In terms of the pulse of the voters here, and whether the Senate or the House reflects it more, they're different in two respects. One is congressional districts can be much more homogeneous demographically, in ways that you have members of Congress that take more extreme views because their constituents are more extreme. So one could argue that the Senate, you'd expect senators of a state to be more moderate because it would be combining the opinions of people from the districts. But that's premised on the idea that what you're looking for is responsiveness to public opinion here. And in this partisan environment, the political leaders have two incentives. One incentive is to get reelected, but their primary incentive are their policy goals and ideologies. And what they will do first is attempt to move public opinion before kind of throwing in the towel and going along with what the public says here. And here it's the case. And this is where the elections have consequences. The Senate will do what it does because it can do it it can do it legally.
Thank you.
And of course, the next election can be a referendum on what they've done. But with respect to the courts, the consequences have occurred, and the Democrats can only make new appointments as they arise.
I would just add one more thing, Yanis, to your question about the terms of the term limits or the term of appointment for elected members of the House and the Senate, and that is that the number of the representation in the House is based on population, and the representation in the Senate is 2 per state.
Right.
So you have an incredible gap there, and that's a really fundamental problem for democracy if you think of democracy as being the majority of the population, because that's not how the US system works.
Well, it was a system that made sense in 1776 or 1786, presumably, but well, we could talk about that for a long time, because there are a lot of things that, as a former foreigner, now newly American, it's just very surprising that you can actually win the public vote, right, as Gore did and as Clinton did, and still lose the election. So
for sure, we're all trying to understand this, how this could have happened, and where we go from here. But let me ask Bob, there are 2 other questions I want to ask. One is the role of the media. In the old days, you started off by talking about politics in the 1950s. So in the old days, there were a very small number of television stations. And there were, most major cities had at least 2 newspapers. So there were some different views being expressed in the newspapers. There's a lot of similarity among the different television channels in terms of the news, their whole disposition. And there was something there that, in a sense, united the country, because they were establishing a system of beliefs and attitude and approach. And when you now open this up with the proliferation of sources, that must play a huge role in creating this polarized world where people see the world in a very, very different way. Because when I, read the New York Times and the Guardian, and don't have a television, my understanding of the world, not to mention, Science Magazine and the PNAS and the Lancet and so on, that my understanding of the world is completely different from someone who listens to this talk radio and Fox and so on. And is there any way we can, there seems to me like that's a corrosive influence that is not going to lead to a good place, already hasn't. Is there anything we could do about that? That's one question. The other question is about science and people's trust in science and in scientists. I mean, it's quite remarkable the way that Anthony Fauci is the obvious person to mention, but it's quite stunning how someone like this can be so easily not only disrespected but vilified by a population. I mean, it's extraordinary. So, what's the consequence of this, and what can we do to change this? Because if we don't have any common basis, any common understanding of what a threat means and how to deal with it, and when the threat can only be addressed by all of us working together, which is the nature of COVID, then this unsuccessful response we've had so far is guaranteed to continue and to apply in other areas. You'll get clear decisions in places like choice of the Supreme Court, which is going to exacerbate the polarization, but you're not going to get the kind of decisions we need in areas like public health to advance the country.
Okay,
or climate change.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, that's a good case.
Yeah,
Which
exactly.
is a root of this anti-science to an important extent.
Yeah. Okay. So you touched on a lot of things, scientists and the media. Okay. So on the media, just a little historical perspective, and some of this economists have studied, because there's a market aspect to this and technology aspect to this as well. Okay. So we talk about the calmer days of the 1950s, or of much of the 20th century. That arguably was an unusual period, because the period prior to that in the 19th century was a period of widespread partisan newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, you name it. Okay, that's the way politics sort of in the media used to be, but it was a much narrower thing. The electorate itself was also narrower too. That is, we didn't have the expanded electorate that we have today. And then there were periods of sort of multiple parties in play. And then there were, of course, regional geographic aspects to all of this as well. In the 20th century, there were also certain norms and values in journalism came about, and in the period of the 1950s, both related to technology, but also related to politics. The media were more homogeneous, so to speak. But also the political system and the parties were more homogeneous. There were conflicts on certain kinds of issues and not on others. But the big change that occurred was the expansion of technology. First, the new media, which is really cable, that came about, which really expanded the number of outlets that are out there. And also what happened with that, and the fragmentation of the politics that was occurring at the same time. I mean, there was no causal relationship between the two. They were just happening arguably on separate tracks. What happened there was that these different media outlets that arose could put together viable business models. That is, they could establish niche markets where they could get enough advertising and revenue to survive. So that these partisan outlets can exist and thrive and be maintained. And the big cases in point, and Fox News is a big case in point. That is, when they started out, they were smaller in terms of scope and audience, and they picked up, but they had a viable economic model there, so that you had a mass media out there that could be partisan, ideological, what have you, and they had markets because people were more partisan and ideological. And so in terms of how much blame the media should be subjected to for all this, it's a very tricky question here, because in terms of the media aren't creating the conflict. The conflict is being created at the level of real politics and political leadership. The upheaval in the 1960s happened, and the parties realigned themselves, and conflict emerged. The media were there to cover it. They amplified the conflict. There's one huge bias in the media. The media is biased toward anything that sells, and conflict sells. To the extent that there's a partisan conflict, they're going to magnify and amplify it, big time. They'll give it a steroid shot. But in terms of them causing the conflict, people selectively choose the kind of media that they watch, or that they consume. And so the media themselves aren't changing people's minds. They may be reinforcing their opinions. So the media are to blame for preventing any mitigation of the conflict that occurs, but it's not causing it. Why the debate last night was very important is that was probably the first time that Republicans and Democrats were being exposed to the same information about the political candidates. Of course, after the debates ended, people went back to Fox News and MSNBC and CNN and got the spin and interpretation of their chosen outlet. But the reality of the debate itself, was there, which led a lot of Republicans to acknowledge that Trump did, not so well in the debate, which they would not have recognized in any of his performance during a certain day or a certain week had they simply got reports about it or non-reports about it from Fox News or the outlet of their choice. With regard to science, now this is really the politicization of science, and how science is viewed and interpreted and framed is a function of what political leaders or what others are saying, or what others whom people listen to are saying about science. During the heyday of science, when everybody thought the U.S. was doing terrifically well in terms of putting a man on the moon, breakthroughs in medicine and all of that, scientists were put on more of a pedestal. Once it's become politicized in the way it has today, and climate change is a good case in point, where the consensus in among scientists is that global warming is real, and mankind is having some effect on this. But the fact that the way that's been responded to by political leaders and political parties and the like has affected how the public sees those issues, because that's where they're taking their cues from. Scott, you need to unmute.
I know, I'm trying to unmute myself. I'm still slow on this process. So we are ably assisted by Andrew Wilson, who is a remarkable PhD student in our Sustainable Development PhD program at SEPA, that exists partly, largely due to the efforts of Jeff Sachs. So Jeff, thank you. You brought these great people to SEPA. Andrew, I think you have a question.
Favorite program.
Here. Yeah, thanks, Professor Shapiro. So I'm just wondering, like, looking for a way through all of this, you've mentioned that there's this well-documented kind of wartime glow associated with uniting people behind the common enemy. As I'm thinking of ways through this like partisan morass, it strikes me that at least among independents, there seems to be just like an opposition to partisanship in general, like a willingness, or at least the appearance of a willingness to compromise or to work together to get things done, is something that independents who are maybe less particularly issue driven are interested in. Do you see that that there's some kind of general political benefit to at least the shorter medium term appearance or actual willingness to work together, to compromise, to dissolve partisanship? And is this a way that we could see a way forward?
Well, that's, as we used to say, the $64,000 question, or 5 times that amount with inflation, or whatever. Talking about independents or moderates is a little bit tricky, because the way partisanship is defined and measures, most of the independents out there tend to lean toward one party or the other. They just don't like the label independent. But there are, and then of course the ones that are truly independent are also less likely to vote as well. So that there's that complication. I think going forward, the best way to, in my opinion, I was going to save this to the end, but I'll bring it up now. In terms of the way you frame the question going forward, the question is among new generations in the population. Those are the independents that could in fact be different from the current older independents who are really partisan in disguise, because as part of a new generation, they may see the world differently. New generations, by the way, are distinctive in the sense of they have a certain appreciation for environmental issues that older generations don't have. They have a better, a more tolerant worldview toward race and ethnicity. They don't see it as much as older generations do. They're not more pro-choice than other generations, which is kind of interesting. But the big question is that they may be the generation that's more likely to be willing to compromise. Now, it used to be the case. It used to be the case that political science, well, some do, that the blame for the current partisan conflict, the finger's been pointed on the Republicans because they've moved more in a conservative direction, which they didn't originally, but the Democrats have been diverging from them, as we've seen. But secondly, they were the party least willing to compromise. That as political leaders dug in their heels more, and their supporters would do so as well. That's actually changed. The public opinion data on this show that Democrats are now more uncompromising than they were before. But the big question is among new generations, immigrant groups in the population, and so forth, through a process of, this is a slower process. This is the longer term, not short term. through generational replacement and the emergence of new leaders who might be willing to compromise. That may be all that we're left with. That's actually my opinion at the moment. Unless current leaders, really completely change their tune and decide that enough is enough, we've got to stop this, craziness that's occurring. I mean, this could conceivably happen after the current election, but I wouldn't hold your breath about that. But I think you're on the right track, but with the caveat that you need to consider different generations at this point.
Great. Jeff or Yanis, do you have another question?
Maybe I'll just continue on the generational issue. There is one theory that the Republican socially conservative, right-wing, white, evangelical base is generationally on its way out as the society becomes more diverse and so on, and that there are very significant generational differences on social issues, so that this is a kind of last stand. There's another view, and also economically much more pro-government among young voters or young demographics. And a question is whether, as today's young become older, they will keep their generational distinctiveness, or whether this is an age-specific factor. So separating age from generation, statistically, I've tried to understand whether this claim that this, I would call it, the Republican majority is doomed generationally, or whether this is just a mirage of change that will come. Just would like your take on that.
Well, they're in trouble in terms of generation and also in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of immigration and the darkening of the population, if I can frame it that very bad way, that bad way. The Republicans have been able to survive thus far by increasing their level of support among white voters. Okay, so that they've offset that, but I think something's got to change at some point. I think with regard to generations versus aging effects, I think the social attitudes on issues of rights and things of that sort, those probably aren't likely to change. Attitudes related to the economy and taxes could change as people get older through life experiences, owning homes and things of that sort. I think this is. We may know a lot more after the current election in terms of how that kind of thing plays out. But the Republican Party, the one thing people didn't fully notice is that in the 2016 election, the voter turnout among blacks was lower, but also Trump did, compared to Romney, a little bit better among blacks and Latinos. So there's the question whether the Republicans can increase their support among those groups and among younger age groups just enough to hold on. They don't have to win those groups by any means, but they need to pick up enough to offset the changing demography that's working against them.
If I could just ask one more question of the same ilk, another narrative is that we have been consumed by cultural and identity politics, and those are very hard divisions, and that an argument for Biden is that he's trying to run much more on economic issues straightforwardly, and leaving aside the strong rhetoric on abortion or anything else, which seems to be the case. For example, how he's treating the Supreme Court nomination and so forth, that was very low key, I would say, in terms of Roe v. Wade and so forth. And the question is whether there's mileage in an approach that deculturizes the politics to some extent and focuses on class-based issues and pulls white conservative voters back to a Democratic base on economic grounds.
Yeah, well, part of the impetus, the continued impetus for that comes from, Bernie Sanders, and his supporters wanting to emphasize those kinds of things. And I think Biden's instincts are to emphasize those kinds of things as well. Where we've heard a little bit of silence on that is from the the more progressive wing of the party, AOC and her supporters. Although AOC is everybody's on board with. Democrats seem to be on board with voting against Trump. I think in the debate last night, the thing that I thought was one of Biden's better moments, and maybe his best moment, as I turned to my wife during the debate, he said something which spoke to that issue without speaking to the issue. He said, "I am the Democratic Party," and which immediately sent the signal that the party's going to focus on what I want to focus on, and he was focusing on dealing with COVID-19, dealing with the economy, and meant that he wasn't going to talk about it. It wasn't what he was in disagreement, but he basically was not going to make those kinds of things an issue. I think that's important here, and especially the other context of this is the whole law and order issue here, which is a throwback to what the Republicans did in the late 1960s as they transformed the party. And that's going to be an issue that will hurt the Democrats in certain places.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm getting some questions from students. I'm the filter. I hope the students think I've done a good job as the filter. So one of the questions, I'm not going to ask all of them, but one of the questions was about this polarization and whether there's ever an end to it. I mean, is this something that is going to continue? Is it going to persist? Or will something cause it to change?
Well, that's a great question. The reason I emphasized the history at the very beginning about the emergence of the partisan differences and also the closeness of elections and so forth is all of those things are here to stay. The parties are going to remain. If the two parties exist, and there's a question about what the Republican Party will look like going forward. This is going to be an open question. There'll be a big fight about that. But even if Trump were not elected, whether it were Hillary Clinton or Senator Cruz or Marco Rubio or anyone else, the parties would be different. The closeness of elections would be different. The thing that would be different is the kind of despicable character of the current president would be different. That is, the people would disagree with the president, but the way they would handle themselves in public, they would not be the kind of bullies that the way Trump comes across. That partisan conflict is here to stay. The big question is how the partisan conflict gets managed, and how it gets managed is going to depend on whether we have divided government or unified government. If there's unified government, the party in power will try to just plow ahead with what they're doing. The Democrats have been complicit in this. That is by getting rid of the filibuster on all government appointments short of Supreme Court appointments. The Democrats kind of opened the doors for the next step, which was to get rid of the filibuster on Supreme Court appointments. You'll have those kinds of changes in policies, which will simply mean the party in power will be able to do what it wants to do, and then elections will have consequences in terms of voting the party out or keeping them in power. What that will look like post-Trump is unclear, but it really depends on how political leaders try to handle and manage this. If they, and what kind of style that they develop. I mean, the current president, the current Republican administration could have gotten done most of what it did. I mean, there's certain, we can debate about certain things. If Trump were president or not, we would have deregulation, we'd have tax reform, we'd have all the court appointments. What we'd have on foreign policy is, it's not clear. But at this point, dealing with the decibel level of politics, the incivility of politics, and also the threat to American democracy are things that could be dealt with. The partisan conflict itself remains to be seen what happens with that.
So there's another question, and Yanis, after I ask mine, you may want to, if you have another one, you could follow, but this is from another student. And the question is that we're facing a global pandemic, so the entire world is being affected. And in the United States, it's being treated as a purely domestic issue. That's actually also true in many other countries. It's quite a remarkable feature of this pandemic that the world is treating it in a very insular kind of a way. So the international dimensions are important to Donald Trump for scapegoat reasons, right? So he can blame the Chinese for this so-called Chinese virus, and not focus on his response to the outbreak, except insofar as he congratulates himself for trade measures. And then he withdraws the United States from the World Health Organization in the midst of a crisis. But Biden, I'm not hearing a lot from Biden about the global picture. And is that because that's not a salient aspect for the election? Or is he just fighting Trump on Trump's own terms in terms of the domestic side? How does the international, relate to this?
Well, I think the domestic issues really have more salience and importance in terms of affecting the outcome of the election. But it's very clear that the Democrats and the Democrats and Biden are very different from the Republicans. I mean, Trump's handling this as the kind of America first domestic kind of issue simply reflects his outlook on foreign policy more generally. He's not an international institutionalist. He's not for multilateral diplomacy, whereas the Democrats have become the party supportive of multilateral relations and international institutions. I think implicit or not explicit, if Biden were elected, he would change at least the demeanor, if not the direction, of U.S. foreign policy, taking a more internationalist, multilateral kind of approach to international affairs, wanting to work with allies, and certainly treating the COVID-19 issue as an international one, and being willing to engage with foreign leaders on this. And it's very important here, given that if the vaccine is developed, there are going to be issues about how to distribute that, and it will be important to control the virus, for the vaccine to be distributed as widely as possible, to provide worldwide coverage of this, because the world is not such a big place. What happens in one country can affect what happens here, given globalization, travel, and travel, should we come back to travel we had in the past, and the like. So it's clear the Democrats will see it differently. They haven't emphasized it here because that would be too much of a distraction from things that they see as more important with regard to the election. And I think what people in the U.S. think is more important, the domestic economy and public health as primary.
So Yanis, we're almost out of time, but do you have a question?
Maybe just a quick follow-up. I don't know whether it's a repeat of what Jeff asked, but I'm curious, is there anything that can hurt Donald Trump? I mean, particularly among his steady base, the evangelicals, and we heard about the infidelities. We know about how he's treating women. We know now that he's paying $750 in taxes when most of us pay, many times that. Corruption. So what is it that could actually hurt this guy among the base? So yesterday's debate, today was they asked groups of people in rural areas across America. They loved it. They thought that he was the man. So I'm really questioning, is there anything that actually would make them open their eyes to the truth?
Well,
I think we all want to know the answer to this question, Bob.
Well, I don't know the answer to the question. I mean, but at some point, the big question is, at some point, Donald Trump will no longer be president of the United States. Now, of course, Donald Trump may be the head of a major media empire where he still has his followers and supporters there, but that's in a context where he himself is out of politics, and his motivation will be more economic and personal glory, and the like. I mean, the big question is what the next Republican what Republican leaders will basically ascend within the party. Will they be more like Donald Trump, or more like more traditional Republican candidates that we currently have? And there's obviously a big difference between Cruz and Marco Rubio and the like. They're staunch conservatives, but they're not Donald Trump, and they will not have support from Trump's base unless Trump endorses particular candidates. So the problem, the issue here is what will happen with Trump's base. Will Trump be able to control it, direct it, or will it simply become fragmented as a result of Trump no longer being the centerpiece of national political attention as opposed to social attention?
Right. So is it a political movement or is it a cult?
Yeah. That's one way to think about it. But it's a cult with political consequences. I mean, there are Republicans out there who could be the next Donald Trump. Well, who could be the next Trump-like candidate. But who don't have the kind of personal, style that he has, which would be an improvement anyway.
Well, Bob Shapiro, thank you so much. We couldn't have picked a better speaker for the day after we have this hangover from the debate, but the collision between this terrible divisive politics and this terrible threat, the coronavirus, has been spectacular and is something for the history books. And I would have hoped that a problem like this would have galvanized the nation and unified it. And what you're saying is we had the wrong person in the position of potential leadership at this time of crisis. And in an earlier meeting, Jeff and I were talking about the important role that the individual plays and not just the institutions. So we've got these social trends, many of which I think are deeply disturbing. It's being reinforced by the technology and access to information and social division, which is enabled by that technology and probably helped a little bit by COVID as well, since people are not interacting as much outside their selected groups. So right now the trends are definitely not in a great direction, but hopefully this will change. Thank you again very much. Jeff, thanks so much for co-chairing again. I hope I didn't take up too much of the time myself.
No, this was a great session, Bob. Thank you so much. Thank you, Scott, Yanis, Andrew. Fantastic.
Thank you for inviting me.
Brilliant. Great. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.